Okay, why did Job have to suffer? Really, we all have this concept that the world should work something like this. If we were in charge, we would probably make it where good people receive rewards and evil people receive punishments. That makes sense. That's how our justice system works. That's how parents typically parent their children. We have the idea that if we reward the good and try to inhibit the evil, we'll get more good promoted and evil will kind of be extinguished. And that makes a lot of sense. Now, to add to that, in the Bible, we see the character of God is described as being all-powerful. So if anyone could set up a system this way, you would think that a God who's all-powerful would be perfectly capable of setting up a system to work like this. Not only that, but the Bible describes God as being all-loving. So if God is all-powerful and all-loving, not only is he capable of setting up a system like this, but we would say he's almost required to set up that sort of a system because that would be the most loving thing to do, we would think. Unfortunately, when you look at the world, you tend to have a lot of this. Evil people receiving rewards and good people receiving punishments. It really feels much more chaotic than what we think it should be. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at it, but this is what you tend to get. You just tend to get a lot of chaos with very good people going through a whole lot of suffering. So the big question is, why is it like that? And that's the question that the book of Job deals with. Now, the book of Job only gives us one chapter in that story. You have to read the rest of the Bible to get all the chapters. But let's start with the book of Job. Here's what you see in the book of Job. Job is described as being a very wealthy man to begin with. He's very prominent, so everything is very good in his life to start with. And he's also described as a person who is blameless. So, at the beginning, things feel very much like this top line, where here's a good person, a blameless person, who's receiving good things. Everything's great. But then you have Satan coming and talking to God, and then God allows Satan to take away all of that stuff. And Job goes down to this state of suffering. And there he's laying on the ground. He's lost all of his children, all of his possessions. He's laying there on the ground, scraping his sores, and he has absolutely nothing. And at this moment, you have three friends come to him. And the three friends try to answer this question. Why is Job suffering? And their solution to it is sin. Because they're operating under the assumption that the universe functions the way we talked about here at the beginning. That if I'm good, I'll receive a reward. If I'm evil, I'll receive a punishment. And so in order to keep their whole perspective working in that way, they say he must be in the evil category, and that's why he's receiving the punishment. And Job says, no, that is not the case. Now, the narrator told us at the beginning of the story that's not the case. So we know that can't be the solution. But Job just wants to know why. Why am I dealing with this? And as we go through page after page of that narrative, we're asking the same question. Why is God letting this go on? Finally, when you get to the end of the book, God speaks. And here's what God says. We would think that God would say something like, I'm sorry, Job. You know, I really messed up here. I shouldn't have let you go through all that suffering. It doesn't make sense. Here, I must have just put you in the wrong category or something. If I thought more about it, I would have never let this happen. That's not what God says. We would expect God to give some really legitimate explanation for here's why the universe is kind of tweaked a little bit wrong at this point. God doesn't seem to do that. Instead, God gives a very surprising answer. God says, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. That's strange. That doesn't seem to answer the question. And the way he says, I know what I'm doing, is he goes back to creation. And he basically says, I made this whole planet. I made all the stars. I made the sun. I made all the animals. I know what I'm doing. That still doesn't seem like a legitimate answer to this problem. Why is Job suffering? God says, I know what I'm doing. Well, after that, God takes Job and puts him back to where he was, except with even more stuff. He gives him this huge reward. And then there's this rather strange detail at the very end of the book. It ends with this very strange detail. Job is required or asked to make some sacrifices or prayers for the sins of the three friends. Because these three friends apparently were in the wrong. They need forgiveness. And now Job is asked to somehow atone for that sin. That's strange. That's the book of Job. It almost leaves us with more and more questions than we started with. So, what's the answer here? If you go further into the Bible and you start putting this into the picture of what happens in the whole rest of the Bible, what does this story tend to look like? What's interesting is it looks like Jesus. Jesus started out blameless. He started out in heaven, in paradise. Everything's great. And then he goes down and he suffers absolutely unjustly. And all people say, you're a sinner. You deserve this. And he's not. He doesn't deserve it. But then God rescues him and exalts him. And at the end, he enjoys sitting at the right hand of God there. And at the end, we find out that he's able to make atonement for all of the real sinners. And so when you look at it that way, you see the book of Job is not just telling us the story of Job's life, it's telling us the story of Christ's life. Okay, that's neat, but it still doesn't deal with the injustice of why Job had to live that. Why is it that Job had to go through the same things that Christ went through here? Maybe not exactly the same things, but lived through a similar story. That's a big question. Why does he do that? Now, by seeing how Christ's life matches up with Job's life, that helps us in one huge area. If all we had was the book of Job, we would likely say, yes, God is all powerful, but no, God is not all loving. If he were all loving, he would not have inflicted this upon Job, or at least allowed it to be inflicted upon Job. That's where we would leave it with. And we would think that here's God, yes, he's so powerful, he's the ruler of the universe, but he doesn't seem to be in touch with Job's situation. He doesn't realize the pain he's inflicting on his creatures. Until you put it in the scope of the rest of the Bible. And then you see, here's Christ. Here's God come in the flesh. And God lives through exactly the same thing. To maybe even a greater extent. Lives through all of that. And we say, God does know. Now we can see God actually understood that path. Now at this point, we don't have some evil dictator who's inflicting wounds on these people. Instead, we have a God who becomes the creature and lives out everything that his creatures are enduring. lives all of that out. Well, that's interesting. That puts a whole different spin on it. That certainly shows us the picture of a loving God, that he would be willing to come down to that extent. But it still puzzles us. Why? Why would we have the creatures living through all of that pain as well? Well, the New Testament talks about this some more. When you get to the New Testament, you find out that here's all these people who became Christians, and they're still going through this same story. That a lot of people in the New Testament became Christians, and then instead of their life getting better, it got worse, and they began suffering as well. Sometimes suffering because they were Christians. And so, in the New Testament, several of the epistles, you have the book of Hebrews and you have the book of 1 Peter and several other letters as well, are written to Christians in this situation where they're down at the bottom here. And maybe they're not suffering as much as Job, but they're certainly suffering. And it's unfair. That's a key thing. They don't deserve it. They've done good and now they're being punished. And so here you have all these Christians who are suffering. So, what do we make of that? How do we explain that? We would think they're doing good, they should go straight to the reward. But in the New Testament, here's the way it's explained. In 1 Peter, whenever it talks about this situation, and talks about it a lot, Peter addresses this many times, what he always does is he goes back to Christ. That he describes their suffering in the light of Christ's suffering. Look with me what he says here. He says, verse 21, here he's talking to people who are going through suffering, and he says this is 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." That's strange. We talk about following the path of Jesus, following in his steps. We don't usually talk about that in terms of suffering. But here he says, you're going to follow in his steps. He left you an example. Verse 22, "He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. For when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." So here's Jesus. He's blameless. There's no sin there. And yet, the keys here is it says that he entrusted himself to God. And it also tells us that God was just. God judges justly. And he's giving us the same example. He's saying what we need to do in that suffering is we need to entrust ourselves to God, and we need to understand that God is just. Look with me as we continue through this. He says, chapter 4, verse 12, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you, to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed." So here it mentions that it's a test, and it mentions that there's going to be this glory. We're looking forward to this part at the end. And then, if you go all the way to chapter 5, or the end of chapter 4, it says in verse 19, "Therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." Suffering according to God's will, that's a strange thing, but he says entrusting ourselves to the faithful Creator. Faithful. Interesting term there. He's actually faithful to us. Certainly goes along with the loving idea. Then, in chapter 5, he says, verse 10, "And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you." So here, he mentions, here at the very end of the letter, he mentions it's just a little while. Not very long, just a short period of time, and then there's the eternal glory. So here's what Peter's doing. He's saying, you're going to suffer for a little bit, and then you're going to be up here as well. So here's what we have. Job's story is not unique. Job's story is the story of just about every human. All of us are going to go through times of suffering, but the end result is going to be this reward for those who are following Christ. So we say, why is that? Why is it that we're going through this whole suffering thing? Why can't we just bypass that and just go straight to reward and skip the whole suffering part? Well, he gives some concepts here. He gives the concept of trusting in God. He gives the concept of the testing aspect. We could add to it all sorts of other passages and talk about how God uses these things to strengthen us, or how this is an example to other people, how it helps other people. We could give a whole lot of reasons, and I think there are a lot of good reasons to give. But I think the biggest reason, when you go through and you look at the life of Jesus, and you see that God himself went through this, when you see that Jesus suffered, and you see the immense good that came out of it in the end, how on the cross it didn't look like any good would come from it. It didn't look like this was a good plan. But in the end, it was that moment of suffering we could see that changed the whole entire universe. It was that moment of suffering that brought the greatest good. It was the time that seemed the moment of greatest evil, that seemed like the point where everything was at its worst. That was the moment that brought about the greatest possible good for this whole entire universe. And so, the idea here in our lives is maybe God has a plan for our suffering to bring about some kind of good as well. I don't always know what that is. You don't always know what that is. None of us always know exactly what that's going to be. But the concept in the Bible really goes back to this. God says, I know what I'm doing. Look around you. Look at this universe that I created. Look at how perfect and how beautiful it is. Don't you think I have the wisdom to know what I'm doing? Well, we thought that someone who's all-powerful and all-loving would create a universe that would operate in a certain way. But what if he is also all-wise? And what if his wisdom is so much higher than ours? Just like we're so tiny on this earth compared to this whole entire universe, whole entire galaxy, solar systems, all that. What if his knowledge is so much higher than ours that when we're down here in this suffering, we say, I don't get it, God. It doesn't make sense to me. And God says, hold on. I know what I'm doing. Just wait. That certainly seems to be the picture that the New Testament writers give. That there is a reason for it, and the reward is certainly all going to be worth it. But rather than falling down and saying, God, you're taking the wrong route, this is not the way my life should go, the correct way is to be like Christ and to entrust ourselves to God. And that builds this faith and builds this close relationship where we can say, God, I don't always know why you're taking me on this path, but I trust you. Did you know what you're doing? I think that's the answer to the book of Job. And I think if we can adopt that kind of attitude, it'll take us through a lot of these really difficult times.